And welcome to this week's edition of Conversations. I'm Jeff DeForrest. Couldn't be happier to be with you today. We always say it's a special edition, and we've been on a roll on the program. Last week, we brought you Umberto Rispoli from California, and he just happened to turn out to be a guy that made maybe the most dramatic stretch run in Preakness history. 150 years of Preakness stakes. This guy squeezes through a hole that nobody could get through, breaks through, then mows down the long shot that was leading the race in the final 50 yards, wins the Preakness, and we couldn't have been happier. Larry Colmus, who was on the show with us last week, absolutely nailed the call of the Preakness on NBC. And I've been chasing this one for a little bit of time here. I was ready to throw in a towel. I was about to get stitched around and maybe put a little Vaseline on the eyeball because I was thinking I really wanted to talk to this gentleman before we got to those fights in Times Square, where he made his comeback as a play-by-play announcer, and a brilliant one at that, although probably had to do his best to make the action seem as compelling as it did during his brilliant career at HBO. So as a matter of introduction, let me do this. Fighting out of the blue corner, and as my great friend Jimmy Lennon Sr. used to say, really needing no introduction the world over. As if some guy from Tijuana could walk into a board meeting on Wall Street of CEOs, of executives, of companies that were dealing in money as large as you could imagine, and they would say, "Oh yeah, that's Ladislav Mihangos, man. Good to see you." We welcome to the show the brilliant voice of HBO boxing and many other things as well. Jim Lampley joins us on the program. Jim, how are you? Thanks so much for doing this.
I'm very well, Jeff DeForrest, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on the show. And thanks for all of the glory in that particular introduction. And now I will try to live up to my billing as a guest.
Well, there's no doubt that you will, because we share some common threads here. And of course, I've been a huge boxing fan, did some play-by-play in boxing myself. And
Oh, did you?
yes, I actually was on a couple of the HBO international calls, I believe, on fights that you did. I know at least one, maybe two, but we'll get to that because we want to get to the gist of the matter here. And we kind of, capitulated to the idea for years that Al Michaels, the great Al Michaels, had written on his sleeve, "Do you believe in miracles?" before he delivered that line, a great signature line of his career, a tremendous career. And we thought, well, he must have preconceived that notion. He probably figured, hey, what are the chances that the Russians would lose to America in Lake Placid? Let me have something ready just in case. But the backstory of, and when you say it happened to anybody, they can picture Michael Moore with the glazed eyes on the canvas, having been knocked out in improbable fashion by George Foreman, big George Foreman, off the comeback trail, 10 years out of boxing, fighting a bunch of stiffs, including Mahango, by the way, who I mentioned. And the backstory on that, and now you have a book out by that same title. You say it happened to anybody, Jim Lampley, they know exactly what you're talking about. So I loved doing a little research, and I saw your comments about how this signature phrase came about. So tell us about that first, and then tell us about what our fans can expect to find in the book, which has to be fantastic.
I never tried to pre-establish a meaningful call by predicting in my mind what would happen. I always thought that was probably a dead-end road to some kind of mishap. So I stayed away from preconceiving anything. And by the way, I sincerely doubt, I really do, that my friend Al Michaels wrote, "Do you believe in miracles?" on his sleeve. I don't think he preconceived that either. I assume that Al came to "Do you believe in miracles?" The same way that I came to "Mike Tyson has been knocked out," and later to "It happened, it happened." And in my book, "It Happened," you can find the anecdote about how I achieved that phrase on the air, and it was entirely something that I came up with during the 10 seconds that Moore was lying on the canvas, because I had not believed the validity of what my friend and broadcast colleague George Foreman had told me at least 2 or 3 times prior to that fight, when I would pull him aside at crew meals or at fighter meetings while working for HBO and find a moment to say, "George, how in the world are you going to beat Michael Moore? He's a southpaw. He's a mover. He's far faster than you are. Holyfield couldn't find him, and Holyfield has better feet than you do. What's the plan? And every time I asked him that, 2 or 3 times at least, George would look at me with that blank, implacable expression of his and say, Jim, you watch. There will come a moment late in the fight when he will come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Always the same words. He'll come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Now, what I say all the time now in interviews is go back to YouTube, get hold of the 10th round of Foreman versus Moorer, watch the action, and tell me that there's some better description than he will come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. There isn't. So when I yelled, it happened, I was really speaking to George and affirming to George that exactly what he told me had in fact come true. Was he a prophet? Was he a seer? Was he some kind of visionary fighter? Or was he just smart about the ring and smart about what he could do and smart about how he could gull Moorer into that by allowing Moorer to bat him around like a tennis ball for 9 rounds, which he did, and therefore giving the 26-year-old heavyweight champion a false sense of security. To this day, I firmly believe that's what George did, and I think it was indeed the product of a plan.
All right, that's the title of your book. We want to give our fans and our viewers a chance to get a little bit of a glimpse inside what it is that is in the contents of It Happened, a brilliant book that you just have out, and it details many of the things about your career, a lot of things that people don't realize, how many different aspects of sports broadcasting you probably were a pioneer in.
Largely because, number one, I was hired into what amounted at the time to a kind of a gimmick job. It became an institution. No one, I think, could foresee at the moment that I was chosen out of a 432 candidate talent hunt, along with one other person in 1974, to be the first 2 people to stand on the sidelines of football games with a camera and a microphone. It was a convention that was derided by many in the sporting press and particularly by college football writers when first Don Tollefson and I appeared on the sidelines of football games. It eventually became, of course, an enduring institution. And now you can't turn on a college or professional football game without expecting to see someone standing on the sidelines, largely doing the same thing that Don and I did that first year and that I wound up doing for 3 years, trying in some sense to invent content or create content that would validate the idea of putting somebody on the sidelines. The only thing that was logical was the very brief interview with the coach at the beginning and end of halftime, where you would get 3 or 4 words of acknowledgement from the coach that you were there, and then boom, on to what came next. But that created an entree and a platform for me at ABC Sports, which I then had to pay off by doing all of the crazy wide worlds 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row, doing the wrist wrestling, the log rolling, the barrel jumping, the motorcycles on ice, the demolition derby, the oriental world of self-defense, all of those things that the other more famous announcers on the staff had all done once. And now I had to be the guinea pig who went back to do those things 3 or 4 times. And that's how I got my pedigree at ABC until eventually, after 13 years and after very interesting assignments at the Olympics, I wound up getting assigned to boxing by an incoming new division president who wanted to get rid of me, wanted to get rid of my contract, and thought that boxing would be the ideal way to do that. He didn't realize even for a second that the very first sports event my mother had ever sat me down to watch by myself after my father died when I was 5 years old was Sugar Ray Robinson versus Bobo Olson for the middleweight championship on Gillette Friday Night Fights in 1955. And under my mother's guidance, I started watching the Gillette Friday Night Fights, listening to Don Dunphy, who taught me everything I know about how to call fights during the years that I watched I don't know, 30, 40 editions per year of the Gillette Friday night fights. And Cassius Clay became my biggest hero in life. Later, I managed to make the psychological transition to Muhammad Ali. The very first live prize fight I ever attended was Muhammad Ali versus, Cassius Clay at that moment versus Sonny Liston, February 25, 1964 in Miami Beach. And I went on to continue to follow boxing and ardently follow Muhammad Ali, and eventually wound up becoming, for a while, Mike Tyson's biographer on ABC, and then Mike Tyson's biographer on HBO. So I had a lot of privileges in the boxing world that were all directly given to me by my mother after my father had died.
Nobody thought that Ali was going to win that fight, as Cassius Clay, 64, at the convention center, except maybe sellout Mo Fleischer, who was a legendary character here in South Florida, who was working with Chris Dundee, and they sold out the fights there at the convention center. It seems like, they had wrestling every Tuesday, boxing every Wednesday, and did great with that. But I was a big fan. That's what I grew up with boxing on, Don Dunphy ringside, Gillette Fight of the Week. That's an anthology that did Bill Caton bury that with himself? I mean, how come we don't see that reprised somewhere? I don't even know if it came up on ESPN Classics, but every week you're watching Hurricane Carter, Dick Tiger, Emil Griffith, some of the greats of that day. And you don't see that reprised anymore, Jim. It seems like a shame that all those fights have been buried somewhere.
Ali was such a huge character and so globally big that he tended to block out the sun on other fighters during his reign and his career. And the general sporting public developed a kind of reflex opinion that, boxing is Muhammad Ali. And that means it's Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier, or eventually it's Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman. But there's nothing else really that's on that level. That was an unwarranted discredit to every other fighter in the sport. There were still other meaningful fighters in the middleweight classes, going down to the lighter weight classes, of course, as had always been the case. But Ali sucked so much of the air out of the room that he made it very difficult for all those other fighters to get attention until his career faded at about the time that Ray Leonard and Tommy Hearns and Michael Spinks and Leon Spinks and other fighters of that generation came along and reinstituted the notion of the broad-based American boxing scene. But by that time, it had become a boutique sport, not a mainstream sport, and therefore didn't get the kind of attention that fighters like Sugar Ray Robinson and Bobo Olson, the two guys that I first watched back in the 50s, had gotten at the height of their notoriety.
It's funny because it seemed like networks were always encouraging guys to become screamers. We had a lot of them in boxing, not to disparage anybody, but you managed to dodge falling into that MO or motif, and were always very eloquent and seemed to know how to gauge what level you needed to be at in terms of emoting what was going on in the ring. But when I go back, I listen to some of those Dunphy calls. I mean, it was pretty simplistic. The guy was very straightforward. He worked without a color analyst, and what was really, really brilliant, almost Marty Klickman-esque in that regard. All right, we want to get into some of the things that happened during your HBO career, some of the people that you worked with. I'll never forget this, HBO was very generous at one time, and being a degenerate gambler, we always loved those freebie trips to Las Vegas. They would offer various radio guys that would be willing to go out there and cover boxing. So Oscar De La Hoya was fighting some stiff named Javier Castillejo, and they were having trouble generating any interest in this fight. You might have been on the call that night. I'm assuming that you were. Okay, so on the undercard, and you'll remember this guy because he was always around boxing and was an LA boxing figure. He wrote for the Herald Examiner for many years. I knew him when I was working out there. A gentleman named John Bayruti. They had Lalo Lidwaba on the card, and I was thinking, wow, this guy is being touted as a second coming of Azuma Nelson among fighters out of Ghana. Now, who's this guy he's fighting? So I asked Bayruti, who's this guy? A Filipino. He goes, I like this guy. I think he's got a shot tonight. I'm like, who is he? Who the hell is this guy? And it was Manny Pacquiao. And that was the debut, kind of. I mean, the first time he sort of splashed on the scene. I didn't even think Freddie Roach would have recognized him until they were introduced in the locker room before the fight. How much of a turning point was that for HBO Boxing when Manny Pacquiao knocked out Ledwaba and then went on to really be kind of a spark, a springboard for a lot of the attention that HBO garnered at that time?
We were looking for a new star. We were looking for personalities who could anchor the lower up to middle weight classes in an era when Lennox Lewis was in the process of taking over the heavyweight division. It was very clear that Lennox was ultimately going to be the ruler of the division. And of course, being mired in an identity crisis between whether he was English, Canadian, or American, we knew he wouldn't be the kind of star that we really needed him to be. Pacquiao was a throw-in opponent against Lesionolo Ledwaba. Larry Merchant and I had seen Ledwaba on the undercard of Lennox Lewis Hassim Rahman in South Africa. He looked immaculate. He looked like he was clearly the best 122-pound fighter in the world. And we didn't really know much at all about who Manny Pacquiao was. In the fighter meeting, he was like a curiosity, and we were learning things about him. He annihilated Ledwaba, took him apart piece by piece, and left the wreckage in the ring. And, I wasn't sure at that moment that he could duplicate that against other opponents, but we knew that was the pinnacle of the division. And he certainly looked like he was undeniably great against Ledwaba. And sure enough, he went on to replicate that in performance after performance after performance and become a legitimate immortal icon in the history of the ring. And it's one of the greatest stories of all time, because you're talking about a kid who at age 10 or 11 was selling stolen cigarettes in the streets of General Santos City to gather the money to eat.
How close did you get to Manny Pacquiao? He seemed like a very likable guy. I remember also the HBO publicity department said, "Oh, could you please put Manny on?" He was fighting somebody, and the fight wasn't drawing a lot of attention. And they said, "Could you please put him on your radio show?" And they convinced me that he was speaking perfect English, which at the time he was not. And we actually got to the point. I wish I had this clip, but we got to the point where he. He made me think that he was fighting Dick Cheney, the vice president of the United States at the time. But how close did you get to him? And then what do you think, Jim Lampley, about his comeback efforts that he's going to attempt to fight for a championship at, what is he now, 40 something?
Well, that never goes well. And it can't be expected to go well, even if he wins the first fight. If he moves close to prominent, big-time, meaningful opponents at this point, his age and inactivity is bound to show up. In addition, as George Foreman would point out if he were still here, he's been sleeping on silk sheets and living in gigantic palaces in the Philippines. This is not a starving, come-from-nothing kid anymore trying to prove himself in the way that he proved himself during the turbulent but constantly upward mobile days of his career. It was very clear in Manny's march through the 122-pound and up to 126-pound and 130-pound weight classes that there was only one fighter who might be able to dismantle that machine, and that fighter was Floyd Mayweather. And in the fight between the great attacker and the truly great counterpuncher, you're almost always commanded by logic to pick the truly great counterpuncher because he has the answers to the more one-dimensional thrust of the really great attacker. Manny Pacquiao was a truly great attacker, the greatest attacker of his generation. Floyd Mayweather was the greatest counterpuncher defender of that generation. And when they met, the logical result ensued.
I was on the call, the HBO International call of the Mayweather Manfredi fight, and I think you were there. This was taking place in Miami, and I remember the guy I was working with was also a big time boxing guy, a big fan, and we watched Mayweather, who it was more of his family name that was known at the time, and we thought, wow, we've never seen a guy as sensational as this, but That being said, and the many great fights that he had, how disappointing. I remember thinking, and this was the beginning. I don't even know if it was the beginning of people saying, "Hey, I'll never buy another pay-per-view fight again." Are you kidding me? That was disgusting. But it seemed like I know there were stories out there that Manny had a shoulder injury and almost Sonny Liston-esque wasn't able to really throw with his right hand. But how disappointing what was that? And what kind of reaction did you get from fans when that turned out to be, you would have to say, kind of a stiff of a fight considering the buildup?
A mismatch. Styles make fights, okay? And again, as I just recently said here, the great defender counterpuncher almost always has the right answer against the great attacker. For 2 years or more prior to the fight, I would be walking down a hallway in a hotel in Las Vegas, or down a street in Las Vegas, or down a street in New York, or a street in Los Angeles, and somebody would yell from across the street or run up to me and say, "When am I going to see Mayweather versus Pacquiao?"
Did they blame you for what happened?
They didn't
It's
necessarily.
like the weatherman, they blame him for the weather.
They just wanted to know when it was going to happen and when were they going to see it, and didn't I think it was going to be a great fight? And whenever somebody came up to me and said that, I would say to them, not for the purpose of deflating them, but just pure logic. What is it that you think you're going to see? Why are you so excited about seeing a fight for which the result is pretty close to written in stone in advance? And the winner is going to be the person who takes all the air out of the balloon and eliminates all the action that you think you're going to see, because that's what this is going to be. This is going to be like watching a scientist dismantle an atomic bomb. And if you think there are thrills in that, no, it's highly mechanical and it's technological. What Floyd Mayweather did to Manny Pacquiao was technical to the point of almost technological, and utterly predictable if you know what happens in the style matchups of that sport. The great defender counterpuncher almost always has the right answers against the great attacker.
All right, a couple of quick impressions here, and then I want to sort of have a little crossover here with our next guest on the program, who was very excited that he was going to get a chance to speak with you, and I think he's even in costume as a result. But we'll let that be a surprise because
I'm in costume. I've got my ring hat on. Yeah.
well, I was worried actually, but when I see a red hat, I start to get the shakes. But Ring Magazine,
I completely forgot about that. Ring, ring.
yeah, point that out before we start getting bombarded with hate mail. But nonetheless, all right, a couple of quick things. Guys that you work with, Larry Merchant, quick impression. What was it like? He's still around, 94 years old. He said, I mean, his famous moment, of course, was if I was 50 years younger, I would kick your ass. He said that to Floyd Mayweather in the ring. What kind of odds would you have made on that fight if he was 50 years younger? And I guess if he was right now, they'd be about the same age. So
I would never count Larry out.
Okay.
Larry was a 135-pound halfback at Lafayette High School in Brooklyn, who told his father when he was in his senior year, getting ready to graduate, he said, "Dad, I want to play college football." And his father said, "Well, Brooklyn College is right down the street, and they have a football program." And Larry said, "No, Dad, that's not what I want. I'm going to go to Oklahoma and play for Bud Wilkinson." So sure enough, Larry went to the University of Oklahoma, and he tried out as a walk-on, and he got a jersey, and he was a member of the Oklahoma Sooners football team under Bud Wilkinson, the team that at one point won 56 consecutive games. So Larry has done a lot in his adult life, proving to people that he can do what they don't think he can do. He was one of the greatest newspaper sports editors of all time. He built a suburban newspaper in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Daily News from 35,000 circulation to more than 250,000 circulation in a few years, largely because of his sports section. When the Phillies won the first 9 games of the 1960 season and led the National League all the way through, 64 season, and led the National League all the way through to the closing day, and had to hang on for one last win on the closing day, but lost the game and lost the pennant to the St. Louis Cardinals. And that broke the hearts of Philadelphia fans who had all summer been expecting to see the Phillies in the World Series. Larry, as the sports editor of the Philadelphia Daily News, went to the World Series, and for 9 straight days wrote as though the Phillies were in the World Series, inventing the box scores, inventing the game narrative, inventing the sidebar, inventing the interviews with Gene Mauch and Phillies players, giving Phillies fans exactly what they had wanted, hungered for, and expected all season long. What other sports editor would have had the nerve and the vision to do something like that? Only Larry. And he had the best staff of boxing writers in the country, because boxing was always Larry's first love.
Early investor in Cloverleaf, the group that managed Joe Frazier. So a lot of people didn't necessarily acknowledge that. All right, we want to bring on a special guest, but I did want to ask you about one of my other favorites, who I got to know pretty well, and he couldn't have been any nicer of a guy. And no HBO telecast really would be complete until you heard the reference. So let's go to the scorecards here. We're about midway through the fight, and you would hear,
Jim, the Russian is beating the living daylights out of Timothy Bradley. 6 rounds to nothing. Provodnikov. Jim.
and he always had to. I know, maybe that was a mandate by the director. I know Bob Dunphy. He always would say, if you were the guy that was doing the outside the ring analysis, or you weren't on the, you were the guy doing the interviews. He said, make sure you mention a guy's name when you throw it back to him. But Letterman was a great guy, and maybe among the more accurate scorecards that we've seen in a sport that is known for more than its share of Adelaide Bird series of atrocities.
I think he had more credibility, Harold Letterman, at the moment when he was doing our scoring on HBO than any other scorer in the sport. I believe that people believed Harold's scorecard more than they would ultimately believe the official scorecards if the two diverged. And of course, Harold was the only one who was getting a chance every couple or few rounds to justify and validate his scorecard in commentary on our telecast. The official scorers didn't have that right. They simply sat at ringside and prevented their scores. But whenever there was a divergence between Harold's card and the card of, say, Adelaide Bird or some other anointed scorer in Las Vegas, I always went with the notion Harold's right. He sees the fights. He was a wonderful man. He had 2 big obsessions in life. One was boxing, and the other was Broadway theater, because his father had taken him to a lot of Broadway theater when he was a boy. So he could recite the details of almost any fight he had ever seen. He was encyclopedic, and he could sing you the lyrics from any Rodgers and Hammerstein play, or Lerner and Loewe, or other big Broadway productions of the 50s and 60s. He was great.
Although I doubt he would have won American Idol with that voice, no matter how into the songs he was. Does that ring in your head as you go to sleep at night? Do you still hear Harold Letterman going,
2 rounds to 1, the Mexican.
You know, you only have to say the word. You only have to say Harold. That's all I need. And I hear him. And I was so privileged. I was given the right by HBO to deliver the eulogy at his ceremonial HBO benedictory after he died. I still have friendship and relationship with his ex-wife and his daughter, his widow and his daughter, I should say. He was a wonderful man and a wonderful friend, and a wonderful ringside scorer, no question about it.
Yeah, his card was one that you could buy into. All right, we're going to bring in a special guest here who's scheduled to join us on the program, and he was very excited that Jim Lampley was going to be on the forum. And we welcome in longtime New York Post columnist and this guy, just man about town. Len Robbins joins us here on the show. I know, Len, you were very excited to do a little crossover here with Jim Lampley before we let him go.
I got to be honest with both of you guys. Jim and I do not know each other well. This was like a nod at, different fights. I was in, with the beat guys, getting my fingernails dirty. And I would always look over and say, man, that guy makes tuxedos look good. And, it's interesting. Listen, first of all, I don't even want to talk. I just want to hear you guys continue to have this incredible conversation. And, I'm hearing great things about the book. I can't wait to get my hands on it. But, it's interesting because I heard you talking about, there it is. There we go.
It happened.
See? That suit looks so much better, right? Because
Yeah.
I wear it right now, right? It was really cool just now listening to you talk about your mom and, you know, the impact that she had on you. My mother just wanted to get me in the ring with her so she could knock him out, get lights out. But, you know, when I was young, this may come as a shock to you, Jim, but this is an authentic Brooklyn accent. I didn't buy it at Costco or anything like that. I would go to my dad and say, you know, I want to be a announcer, right? I want to be a play-by-play guy. And we would be watching a fight and he'd say, listen to this guy, Jim. He said, that's a voice. He said,
Yeah.
that's a voice.
Well, I hope I did not in any way prevent you from at least giving it a shot, you know, because of course, boxing blow by blow people are my buddies and my fraternity mates. In fact, I just received yesterday in the mail Steve Albert's book. A funny thing happened on the way to the broadcast booth, and he was smart enough to put that title onto a baseball cap, and I received the baseball cap. So now I have a baseball cap that I can wear that says a funny thing happened on the way to the broadcast booth, but I don't have a baseball cap that I can wear that says it happened because we weren't smart enough to put that promotional item together. But that's okay. I'm promoting ring, and that's boxing and the Bible of boxing, and it's a good thing to do.
You know, one of the things that's come through clear on this is so many of these people that you guys have talked about were real guys. I mean, just real human beings. I go to a bar in Williamsburg, a tavern in Williamsburg, Teddy's, which has been there forever. And one day I'm in there with my wife. I think it was the third or the fourth one. And I hear, hey, Len. And there's Steve sitting in the corner. He's got a fight that night at Barclays. And he's, you know, having a cold one. It was alcohol free, who's ever employing him. And, you know, now we're just like sitting at the table with him shooting the breeze. Larry Merchant came up to me when he, you know, he goes, who he is from the Post? I hear there's a guy here in Post. And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, stand up. And he looks at me, he goes, throw a jab. And I throw a jab. And he goes, can't get good help anymore. I wasn't going in the ring. Right?
Larry could be wildly funny. He really could.
Yeah. So, you know, that's the great thing. I really hope, you know, there's a reason why adages like, you know, history's doomed, you know, to those who don't study it. I really hope people read this book. You know, I really do. And I say this about so many of the other great writers of Jim's time, my time, your time. Writing has changed so much. You know, now everybody talks about the narrative, and you wonder if you're ever getting the truth. If you're ever really getting an accurate, honest recap of how it happened. And that's why I'm so excited about this kind of thing.
Yeah, the other thing too. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
The book is dedicated to my mother and my grandmother, who taught me how to tell stories after my father died when I was 5 years old. They were competing for my attention. They were both inveterate, nonstop storytellers. When I ultimately decided I had cycled through everything else I was interested in, and now it was time to write this book, I made no outline. I didn't take any notes on what I wanted to write. I sat down, put myself in the mindset of my mother and my grandmother, and wrote the book Stream of Consciousness. And my As Told To author said to me once it was done, he said, you know what? You've finished. You've written the book. And I said, is it a good book? He said, no, Jim, it's a great book. So if it's a great book, I owe that to my mother and my grandmother for teaching me how to tell stories. And I owe boxing to my mother, who sat me down and repeatedly said, it's Friday night. It's time to watch Gillette Friday Night Fights. Don't let this pass by. Don't go out with your buddies. Sit here and watch this fight. And I saw dozens and dozens of great fights on the Gillette Friday Night Fights when I was a kid growing up.
Before we let you go, We got to talk about this. We mentioned your pioneering, endeavors, and you mentioned the sideline reporting. Of course, one of our dear friends is the lovely and talented Leslie Visser, who was a pioneer. She said that she's won so many pioneer awards in broadcasting. She was hoping that she would get a coonskin cap.
I met her the second week. I met her the second week that I was on the sidelines. Literally. Okay.
Wow.
But we went to Boston to do a game, and I was introduced by Mike Lupica to Leslie Visser, who was iconic at Boston College at that time, and moving forward toward her great career. So
she just did the graduation ceremonies up there after 50 years after graduation.
Wonderful.
Just this past week.
Hey,
But
Defo.
WFAN, and Jim, of course, you were the first guy, having spent more than half my life, over 40 years in sports talk radio, when seeing the genre change to the point where finally the corporate suits just diminished it to the point where it was no longer a factor. I always say this, I'm probably the only guy that ever lost a starting job to Brady Quinn, as they ended up replacing us on our local show.
That's a good line.
That's the truth. And you probably have never been on a show before that had sirens and dogs barking at the same time and whatever extraneous noise that we can dig up. But what was the pioneering days at WFAN like? And did you ever think that the sports talk would evolve into what it did before finally they put the final dagger in it and are starting to lead it into its grave?
I had been offloaded by ABC Sports after 13 years. I had been forcibly dispossessed of my unique heritage and legacy at ABC by an executive who wanted to get rid of me, who assigned me to boxing to try to embarrass me out of the job. He wasn't going to embarrass me with boxing, but eventually my agent said, you know what, there's no point in beating your head against a brick wall. He wants to embarrass you. He's going to keep finding ways to try to do it. You simply have to walk away from this contract. Had 3 years remaining, guaranteed money, et cetera, et cetera. So with sorrow in my heart, I walked away from that contract. And the next thing my agent said to me is, okay, you need to look around for things that will give you new exposure. And there's an entrepreneur from Indianapolis named Jeff Smullian who has bought license for it was a New York station, I think WNBC, and he's beginning and setting up a 24-hour-a-day sports talk radio format that had not existed before, and he wants you to be the linchpin talk show host. So I had a meeting. I liked the idea. I agreed to become the first on-air host of WFAN radio. I brought the station on the air July 2, 1987. I wrote a lengthy introductory manifesto that suggested, whimsically, sarcastically, all the things that might happen as the result of this new medium, such as Vinny from Queens would execute and construct trades for the Rangers, such as Artie from White Plains would make trades for the Knicks or fire the coach, et cetera, et cetera. All sorts of whimsical ideas that couldn't possibly take place. They all did take place, okay? Everything happened. I even said on that first day, eventually there will be 3 of these stations in Salt Lake City doing all jazz all the time. It happened, okay? So I wound up spending a few years in sports talk radio, tremendous experience, fascinating to watch a new medium develop from the ground up. And it left me with an understanding of how media do develop and how they're influenced by their inherent circumstances, monetary, engineering, personnel, organizational, et cetera, et cetera. And I wound up teaching a course about that here at the University of North Carolina for 5 semesters. I would never have had the vision to do that without WFAN.
We got the great Len Robbins wearing his Gleason's Gym shirt in your honor. You've been extremely generous with your time, Jim. I know we had this set for about 20 minutes. You went 40, so that was good. We had extra rounds. A million things more that I'd love.
Story of my life. 20 minutes is always 40. Thank you.
Well, not for me anymore. That's for sure. Thanks so much for joining us. It happened. Well, where can people get the book? Conventional means, I guess, always applies.
Well, you can find it Amazon. You can find it Barnes & Noble. You can find it in your nearby neighborhood bookstore. We got a little neighborhood bookstore here in Chapel Hill. John Grisham and I together sold 100 books there the other night. I sat at the Wild Card Gym the other day and autographed nearly 200 books. So it's selling. It's probably selling a little bit more than the publisher had anticipated. At least I hope so. And for the moment, if you just Google on the web, "It Happened," you'll figure out a way to get hold of the book.
Can't thank you enough, Jim. Love to do it again
Can't
sometime.
thank you enough. Chance to talk about "It Happened."
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for being with us. Jim Lampley, ladies and gentlemen. All right. We're going to continue here with my man, Len Robbins, because we wanted to get into a little New York Knicks versus Indiana Pacers and try and zero in. Who better to characterize the mindset, the psyche of what's going on in New York City right now? The Big Apple is the Knicks. Are they the only hope? I mean, we always joke about this, Len, and thanks so much for doing this. I don't know, we're getting some strange background music noise in there. I don't know if we can put a little quelch, on that. But
Is that on my end or your end?
I think it's you. But it might have been Garen, our producer. But nonetheless, sounds good now.
It's okay. I might be able to do this. It doesn't sound like a siren, does it?
No, there were people chasing you, I think, earlier in the show. All right, so they always joke about this, and you've written about it, no doubt, many times. They characterize a series where we have Minnesota and OKC left. OKC was a great team, but nobody really acknowledged that during the regular season. They were all hoping the Lakers or Golden State might make their way into the championship round. And we have the New York Knicks in Indiana. And the joke always was, well, geez, if it's Indiana versus Minnesota, they're going to be jumping out of the buildings there at, wherever they house the executive offices of ABC, I guess, will be televising the finals. What do you think? I mean, is it possible that we end up with a dueling stiff in the NBA championship round this year? Or are the Knicks going to reprise what they did in 1973? And going back, I was watching this thing with Michael Rappaport last night at 30 for 30. 1969, just a magical season. They won the championship in the 69-70 year the first time, and then came back and won it again a few years later. But what is the thought process in New York? How optimistic are people? And what do you think about this matchup, Indiana and the New York Knicks?
The moment they went up against the Celtics and it's 3-1, right? People were already talking about the fact that there is no reason why they can't get to the finals now. And sometimes the stars, align perfectly. Think about this, right? Yankee fans understand that at some point it's going to go south. They're not going to win the World Series for the 37th consecutive year or something. It's like they've got their own Ranger streak, right? Mets fans are conflicted because they don't like this role of, wow, we're supposed to be good. We spent a lot of money. Like, where are good guys who give it the old college try and, hopefully we're still playing meaningful baseball in July. Like other teams talk about playing meaningful baseball in September. We're like, September. Oh my gosh, right? Preseason football is the only thing Jet and Giants fans have to look forward to, right? I mean, the league's looking to cut down on preseason games. Jet and Giants fans want to extend it, right? So here we have the Knicks that, they haven't won since 73, right? 73 is when you get bar mitzvah if you're Jewish, right? The Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam. Can the Knicks please win? They haven't won since then, right? I've got two sons, right, who are both, big sports fans, and I want this for them because I want them to know this feeling, because it could be like what I call the Dan Marino syndrome, right? You get to the Super Bowl as a rookie, you never get back, right? You just never know. As for the Western Conference, I'm still trying to figure out where in Oklahoma City is. In Indianapolis, if you blink for 5 minutes, you pass it on the highway, right? Look, I'm clearly facetiously, poking.
No, you're right on the money there, because their big restaurant everybody says you have to go to in Indianapolis is St. Elmo's, and what are they known for? A freaking shrimp cocktail.
It is a
I mean,
hell
who
of a
doesn't
drink,
have a
man.
shrimp cocktail?
Now, have you been there? Have you tried it?
I've told you this story. I was there with Luby, who produces our morning show here on Bleacher Brothers, and we're waiting for a table, and the guy gives us a look, like says, "Okay, I think I can take you in 10 minutes," and then we watch as they give our table away to Jim Gray. There is no bigger embarrassment than losing your table to Jim Gray. I mean, it just turned me off. We ended up at White Castle or whatever that was, which is headquartered there, and I thought, well, what a crap hole of a city this is, Indianapolis. I never want to come back here, even if I had free tickets to a luxury suite for the 500. Never
Well,
want to return again. And they told me that Larry Bird was going to roll into the box there and talk basketball with me on an exclusive interview. I still wouldn't go back. Yeah,
okay.
nondescript place. You were right about that. Nondescript, 1,000%, except for Reggie Miller's scoring in those last few seconds against the Knicks that one year.
Right. Now, here's the thing about Indianapolis, right? If you said to most people, when you think Indianapolis, what do you think, right? Think the
Yeah.
Indianapolis 500, right? And having covered two of them, I believe, I've come away both times convinced of one thing. It's the best sporting event in America for everyone who's short between a half and a quarter of a chromosome.
Yeah, why don't they just do away with the first 498 miles? Wouldn't it be a better event?
Look, if I want to see great drag racing.
Oh, wait. Garen, our producer, is a big NASCAR guy, so we have to be careful about what we say here. But I would much rather watch Lampley's recreation of those demolition derbies from the West Islip Speedway.
I didn't dismiss the race itself.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a fan of the left turn, it's great, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm talking about the people who are in the infield. Some of them have just posted bond, right? So, I mean, I know there are some beautiful, campers now these days, right?
Yeah.
Like walls come out and big screen TVs drop down and there's an escape hatch for everybody right under it. But I'm just talking about the people who decide to frequent this race clearly don't know that most hotel rooms have a shower.
Nor have they spent much time at a hotel that was more than $9.99 a night. You're right about that. But so what chance does that give us? I mean, are they being summarily dismissed? Because look, Indiana, were not for the fact that Boston had the easiest run, I think, ever to a title, where in every series the key player from the other team was injured. And then they get the luck of the draw. And even in that series, when they got the Mavericks in the final round, instead of the Nuggets, they ended up having a depleted Maverick team with Doncic nursing an injury. So I don't know. How much of a surprise was it to you that Boston went down to the New York Knicks? Even after the Tatum injury, clearly you thought that the Knicks would prevail, but they got smashed in that fifth game, and you thought, that's not a good sign. But came back and redeemed themselves. But if you're analyzing this matchup, Len Robbins, what do you see on paper?
Well, I'm shocked that the Knicks got through the Celtics. Or more accurately, I'm shocked at the way the Celtics played. I'm shocked. You give up that 20-point lead in game one, and, you've got more sports psychologists than they have down at IMG or something, telling you about, the Celtics knew they could beat the Knicks whenever they wanted. They got up big. They stopped paying attention. They started taking threes from Boylston Street, blah, blah, blah. All right. So, they pissed one game away, right? But then it happens in game two. And now you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a second, right? And to me, the fascinating thing about this right now is like the narrative on the Celtics, right? The Celtics were a month away from putting themselves firmly in the conversation of, are we looking at a dynasty, right? Back to back, two young stars in Tatum and Brown, who they've locked up. Great culture up there. There are a few people in sports who I have more respect and admiration for than Brad Stevens. Anyone who just spends 5 minutes with this guy walks around saying two things, right? Wow, what a just stand-up guy, and he's smarter than me. I can't tell you how much I respect that guy, right?
Yeah.
But now you look at them, and they're not going to have Tatum for another season. The coach never got it in their heads to stop jacking up threes when you're up 20, right? How much longer can Al Horford, one of the classiest guys in the history of the NBA, have left, right?
I actually think that was Tito Horford out there watching him in the last series.
KP showing to be the fraud that, I think a lot of us in basketball really knew he was, and one of the few European guys, by the way. European guys tend to be more humble, more appreciative of what they have here. Certainly the African guys are. KP was not of that mold. He came here believing he was the greatest thing, since the stretch forward position was, created, and he's not, he's clearly not. So now you look at the Celtics, and by the way, the point guard, Holiday, great family, unbelievable human beings, but he's 35, and the way he plays, you can't play like that for much more than, maybe a year or two. So now you look at the Celtics and you're like, wow, what's happened? And you look at the Knicks and the Pacers, I'm just fascinated. I think they match up tremendously. Halliburton won the clandestine vote by the players as the most overrated player. Right? Was it?
Could be, yeah.
In the NBA.
And his father probably would be somebody that Jim Lampley might be doing play-by-play as he continues his career.
And a lot of people think Brunson is overrated, right?
See, I don't believe that. I think he's been great, and he's emerged in an even stronger fashion. He was good with Dallas, but wow, has this been involved?
I think the thing with Brunson is, I think people look at him. I call this the Jokic factor, right? People still look at Jokic and say he's not one of the greatest of all time. Look at that body.
Yeah,
they can't wrap their head around the fact that, okay, so he doesn't look like Hakeem Olajuwon, right? But he does things that no center has ever done before. They look at Brunson and they say, did he lose out for Pillsbury Doughboy 7 years ago, right? How could he be that strong? How could he be that quick? How could he hit so many clutch shots? How could he be such a savant of the game? They can't wrap their heads around it. So I think this is a fascinating matchup. And yeah, I do think the Knicks are going to win.
All right. Well, where would you weigh in on this? And I guess some of this answer might depend on the results of the two series that are being contested in the East and the West. But I was trying to figure out. I mean, you see trades made, and everybody wants to figure out who got the better of it. I thought that getting Karl Anthony Towns for the Knicks was a brilliant move. I didn't know that Randall really was going to be a solid player. He was often injured, and sometimes in the big moments, he didn't come up as large as you would like him to. DiVincenzo was a good player, but I didn't know that he was any superstar status. Where do you weigh in on the trade that was made between Minnesota and the Knicks, the Towns trade for Randall DiVincenzo, and I guess there were other players thrown in there, but who came out on top in that, if anybody did?
Yeah, I think this is what irks people a little is, you want to trade where one team clearly fleeced the other, right?
Yeah, it seemed pretty even, though.
Right, Lakers, Mavs, right? And you look at this trade, and the reality is this. Julius Randle is a very, very good basketball player in my mind. In my mind, he is not a great basketball player. And in New York, they had him slated to be the great player. He was the number one star. And as long as you put that in his head, he's not going to thrive. And he had a hard time thriving in New York, excuse me, as a lot of athletes do, because everything you do is just scrutinized. Think about this. I remember the last time I went to Oklahoma City with the Nets, there were 7 lights in downtown. That's it. Once you get out of that, 8-block radius or whatever around the
tumbleweed blowing by your car windshield.
Yeah, you got stop signs. Can you imagine if there were only a few traffic lights around Madison Square Garden, the rest were stoplights? We would look
much is that isn't that the way people drive?
Well, that's a whole nother story. But we have backups here, in Beijing. We have 5-mile long bumper to bumper. You can't get out for 2 days, right? So, same thing with Minnesota. He can sort of do it in the background a bit, right? He's not the guy, right? Anthony Edwards is the guy, right? I think it's worked out perfect for him. And I think it's worked out perfect for the Knicks that, Brunson emerges and Towns gives them a great player for Brunson to work with. He may not be a great center, but he's a great player for Brunson to play with.
Seems that way. I mean, look, that's what impresses me because that fall away that he hits after I don't know if they call traveling in the NBA and changing of pivot feet that might make a difference in his ability to produce these kind of results. But still, all that being said, with the flopping that everybody accuses him of, I've been amazed, but by not only how much of an instrumental part he's been of any success the Knicks have had, but the way that he's progressed over the last couple of years. So, all right. So as we have about a minute left here on the program, what do you see as the outcome of first Knicks, Indiana, and then who are they going to face in the final round, whichever team survives?
Like Knicks, probably in 7.
Okay.
And for some reason, I'm kind of liking this Minnesota team. The thing that I'm concerned about there is, Rudy Gobert spent the better part of the last 2 weeks trying to defend whether he did or didn't break up with his girlfriend, and they have a child, and now they're expecting another child, and they're in one of these social media narrative wars, right? Where she's talking about how she dedicated her life to him, and he's saying that he really is a great guy who wants to take care of everyone. But nowhere have I heard, let's win game 1.
Right. Yeah, no, and the Ant-Man, I guess everybody's trying to make him into the next big superstar in the league. He's shown that he has the credentials, maybe to fit into that category. I don't know if he's quite there yet, but this would certainly be a nice springboard for him as a platform. If they can knock off Oklahoma City and come away and be in the NBA Finals, that would really be something. But if it does turn out to be Minnesota, Indiana, I mean, will you be out there with a net outside of the ABC executive offices, hoping that the building's not too tall? I'm not sure where they're located, but you would have to think the executives would be, going to bed at night with a cyanide cap next to their bed.
If it turns out to be Minnesota or OKC, right, and Indiana, I'm just going to start going down to the Jersey Shore because they don't have a grandfather character on Jersey Shore. And I think I'm built a little, right? I haven't done roids, and I got the accent. All I got to do is let the hair grow a little, put like a bunch of gel in it. I got tattoos. I got 2 little tattoos. I don't know. So that's about my interest in Indiana and whoever else comes out of the West.
All right, Len, always a pleasure, man. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you. I mean, adorning the Gleason's gym shirt. I didn't know if you were a boxing guy or not, but how can you not? I didn't realize Jim Lampley too had done so much. I did a little Wikipedia thing. I was like, wait a minute, this guy was the original guy on WFAN. I remember seeing him on the sidelines and thinking, what is this all about? When he was doing college and pro football from the sidelines, and they had no sideline reporters. And then, of course, a 30-year run on HBO Boxing, which many people would say that Jim Lampley was the best to ever do it, with all due respect to the late, great Don Dunphy, who I grew up on with as well, with the Gillette Fight of the Week. So, hey, thanks so much, Len. Always a pleasure having you on any program that we do, and I really appreciate you taking time to be with us here today on Conversations.
Defo, it's my pleasure, and I love how, you got Jim for 20 and kept him for 40. You got me for 20, got me out in 10. Story of my life right here. You're the best. I love you. You know that.
Thanks so much. All right. Len Robbins, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, Jim Lampley joining us here in Conversations. Our thanks to Garen for a wonderful job of producing the show today. We did a lot of things on the fly. Didn't know exactly how it was going to go, but that's always the fun of the business. Lampley with his book out, It Happened, which the backstory on that's pretty cool. He says, look, he was telling George Foreman, there's no way that you should even take this fight. And then he knocks out Michael Moore, as he had very confidently told Jim Lampley, he's going to come at me at some point, stand in front of me. I'm going to land one and lay him out. And after taking on a series of stiffs following a 10-year layoff out of the game, George Foreman became the oldest heavyweight champion of the world. And that was literally after beating up in the Steve Zuskis of the world. So highly unanticipated, and a great line by Jim Lampley. Great spontaneous response as an announcer. Now the title of his book. So hopefully you guys will get a look at that, because we could have talked to Jim Lampley all day. And of course, Len Robbins is always a delight to have on a program. Thanks so much for Garen. Late minute substitution here. Got in there and produced the show for us, did a masterpiece. And thank you guys for tuning in. We'll catch you next week on the next edition